Hello everybody and welcome back to the Tiny Fibre Studio. You are watching episode 36 of the 51 Yarns Spinalong, and this week it's luxury. For anybody who's keeping up with the series in real time, yes, it has been a significant length of time since I last did a 51 Yarns video. Apologies for that. However, I definitely want to get all 51 yarns completed. So I've set up a planner and everything, so you know, stuff's getting serious. And the first thing that I needed to do was to finish off this episode. I actually finished spinning my luxury fibres in December. So I have the footage from that, but I wasn't kind of narrating it at the same time. So it just made it a little bit quicker and easier to film. So let's talk first of all about what we mean when we say a luxury fibre. What is a luxury fibre? As far as I'm concerned, I define a luxury fibre as being something that is very fine, in other words, you know, small micron diameter, very difficult and labour intensive to produce, and very rare. So the fibres that I'm going to be talking about today kind of fit into all of those. Broadly though, if we're talking about luxury fibres, you could be talking about silk. I've already dealt with silk in a completely separate episode, so if you want to watch that, I think it's mid-teens, something like episode 17 is silk. I will try and remember to put a link in the description below. So silk is one. Obviously it's produced by very, very tiny creatures, and you know, it's quite labour intensive to actually get that finished product. You could also include alpaca and llama in this list. I'm not going to talk specifically about those today, partly because I feel like they're getting more common and more easily accessible, partly because now there are alpaca farms all over the UK. That didn't used to be the case. So, you know, we used to have to import it. Now it's kind of more readily available. So I'm not going to be talking about alpaca or llama in this episode. But the luxury fibres, which are considered to be probably the most luxurious, like if you went to people in the street and asked them what they thought of as being a luxury fabric, they would probably say silk, but they would also mention things like cashmere. The ones that I'm going to be talking about most in this episode are the undercoat varieties of fibre. So those are the ones which are produced by double-coated animals, and the down coat, the undercoat, is manually separated from the hair that is on top. Technically the undercoat is also a hair. But that's things like bison, yak, cashmere, kvyat, which comes from muskox, and vicuna, which is the sort of creme de la creme of luxury fibres. Unfortunately, I don't have a spare £600 kicking around that I can justify spending on 100 grams of vicuna, so I'm not going to be looking at that in this episode. So instead, I'm going to focus on camel and cashmere. So cashmere is a fibre which comes from goats. It is not a specific breed of goat, which is what a lot of people imagine it to be, but in order for it to be cashmere, considered to be cashmere, it has to be the undercoat of a goat, and it has to be 19.5 microns or less. A micron is a millionth of a metre, so very, very incredibly tiny. So it has to be 19.5 microns across. On average, a single goat might produce around 200 grams of fibre a year. So that certainly brings in the sort of rarity elements. Like, you can have a lot of goats, but that's not a huge amount of cashmere to go around. And as with a lot of the other luxury fibre animals that I talked about, the undercoat has to be manually separated from the top coat. In some cases, that's literally done by hand combing the animal. So incredibly labour intensive process, and therefore, you know, that's a lot of human hard work that goes into that, therefore the prices tend to be higher. I spun 2 samples of cashmere, which I have here. And they were very, very different experiences. So this first one, this was labelled as carded cashmere. As you can see, it's a teeny tiny little sample. It was labelled as carded cashmere, and it was a nightmare to spin. I hated it. Now, one of the common factors with a lot of luxury fibres, excluding things like silk, alpaca and llama, is that the fibres are very, very short because it's the undercoat of the animal and it's all kind of quite close to the skin. So I was expecting short fibres. When I was spinning these fibres with all of these, I was on quite a high ratio, so high number of twists per treadle. I was doing this on my Shat Matchless, and this one was just hideous. What was happening was, you'll see that the fibres on this are incredibly short, and I don't just mean just less than an inch, I mean like a quarter of an inch or less, and really, really neppy and just nothing of substance to hold together. It was like spinning dust. Like I say, it was labelled as carded cashmere. I wonder whether it should have actually been labelled as carding waste from cashmere, because that's more like what it felt like to spin. I was having real difficulty. I had the wheel on the highest ratio I could. I had the flyer cross-laced to provide less drag, so that you're not getting as much tension on the yarn. I had barely any break tension. I was having to really give the yarn to the flyer. It was just hideous, and there was a lot of swearing, and therefore I don't actually have any footage of me spinning said sample because it was so horrific. It's a usable sample vaguely, but it's really not pleasant. As I say, it's very, very neppy. It holds together, but I have no idea what is holding it together. It's being held together by fairy dust right now. That's literally the only thing I can think of. Yeah, not an experience that I would want to have again, although the fibre is really lovely and warm, and this is one of those fantastic properties of a lot of the undercoat breeds, is that their undercoat is many, 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 many times warmer than wool. So if you're somebody who lives in a very cold climate, or like me, just gets really, really cold really easily, then cashmere is definitely something to look into. However, my advice would be don't buy it if it says that it's carded, unless you can see it first and make sure that there aren't little neps and bits and bobs in there. Yeah, it was hideous, wasn't it, Safi? Do you remember it? If you could not eat the camel, that would be fantastic. Yes. Good girl. Can you sit down, please? Yeah, I know. I'm yours. It's fine. Can you sit? Clearly not. Anyway, so yeah, that was a hideous experience. Didn't really want to go through it again, but I thought, okay, let me have a look at the other cashmere fibre that I got. These were both sample packs from Wing and Woolwork at Wonderwool last year. So little sample packs, they weren't expensive, they're about £1 a time. Great way of getting to know the fibre. And I did look on their website just to see if I could find this nightmare one again, and it's not on there, so I'm hoping that they no longer sell it. Yeah, I would say if you see carded cashmere on there, maybe assume that it's actually carded waste. I opened up the other pack of cashmere because I thought, well, let me just have a little look and see, whether it's significantly different. Oh my word, was it different. It was like a whole other ball game. This is so lovely, and it is just a little sample, but it's so light and soft and just gorgeous. It was easy to spin. I think with that first sample, I tried spinning it a few different ways. I was going between trying to long draw it, and when long draw wasn't working, I was doing kind of short backward draw, but letting some twist into the drafting zone, because with these you do have to treat them like a woolen preparation, in my experience at least. So when I started to spin this one, I was doing a long draw, and I think it's successful. I like it. It's lovely, lovely and soft, and actually relatively consistent. And yes, I would definitely spin this again. So this one, if you compare it to this Hideous Nightmare skein, was a very different fibre. It wasn't top as such. I mean, it wasn't labelled as top, and it wasn't quite organised like top, but it was a million times more organised than that first lot of fibre. You'll see the little comparison here, that first one was full of neps, full of incredibly short fibres. This one at least had pretty much the same length throughout, roughly an inch and a quarter maybe. So it was a lot easier to spin. There was no swearing involved, there was just a lot of, ooh, this is really lovely and soft and warm, and I like this. So yeah, definitely fibre prep made all the difference in this one. So that was my sample number 2. Sample number 3 was camel. This is not as soft, and this is not baby camel, this is just like adult camel undercoats. It's not as soft, it is slightly hairy in places, and this is something that you definitely want to watch out for, is when you're buying luxury fibres, you want to look for D-haired, whatever it is, so D-haired yak or whatever, because that is what will take out the scratchier fibres, so that's something to look out for. With the camel, I did this as a sort of modified short backward draw, where I was letting a bit of twist into the drafting triangle. And again, it was an absolute pleasure to spin, just very, very easy long draw backwards and forwards. Also pretty warm and pretty squishy, but definitely not as soft as something like the Cashmere. That one was lovely. One of the resources that I relied on a lot for this episode was the Judith MacKenzie video, Spinning Luxury Fibres, which you can get through Interweave. Interweave do regular sales, so it's worth looking out for those. You can get some really good deals once the sales come in, and yeah, they're pretty frequent, so you should be able to pick up a little bit of a bargain on that one. But it's so packed full of information, and Judith goes through all sorts of different luxury fibres. So she does talk about alpaca, she talks about silk, she talks about undercoat breeds. It's fantastic. So highly, highly recommend that video. And I also did a lot of research with the Fleece and Fibre sourcebook as well. The latter section of that has a lot of the luxury fibres, the camelids and downcoats as well. So with the camel, I was spinning this one kind of supported long draw, and it was really easy to spin, really, really nice product at the end as well. It's not as soft as the Cashmere, but again, it does have that property of being really quite a warm fibre for its weight. So that was my experience of spinning luxury fibres. It was definitely very enjoyable. I would love to spin a little bit more Cashmere because, as I mentioned, I do get super cold really, really easily. So Cashmere would be a really good fibre for me to spin up something like a cowl or a hat or something to keep me nice and toasty. But while I was doing that, it did get me thinking a lot about the sourcing of our luxury fibres. Recently, at least in the UK, there has been a lot in the news recently about fast fashion brands stopping selling things like Angora and Cashmere and even wool in some cases. don't get me started on that. Because of videos surfacing about animal abuse that was potentially in their supply chain. And so, you know, public concern and their desire to look like an ethical company made them pull these products, if they ever stocked them in the first place. So those companies had concerns over the ethical treatment of the animals that were potentially supplying the fibre, particularly those in China, which is one of the main producers of cashmere. And there's also a lot of concern over the environmental impact that large herds of goats have on the local landscape there. So that then leads to you thinking, well, okay, so if I want to spin this stuff, A, how do I know where it's coming from? And B, how do I find, you know, a supplier that I'm happy with? And the bottom line is every single decision that we make as human beings has an impact either on our environment, the animals that we share the planet with, or other humans, other ecosystems, and so on. Every decision has an impact. So we have to try and find a way that we feel comfortable with. We have to try and sort of filter every decision against, you know, our personal values and the impact that our decisions are going to have on the planet. And I feel like that should be important to all of us, because our fibre that we use for our hobby comes from beautiful animals who we would like to have beautifully treated in beautiful surroundings by beautiful people. It's a very, very complex issue because there's also the carbon footprint of livestock of any description and all of that stuff. But as I say, we've got to make decisions that we're personally, ethically happy with. And certainly for me, I am much, much happier with the idea of buying animal fibre from trusted sources where I know that animals have been well treated and that the environment around their home has been looked after and maintained. I'm much happier with that than with the idea of using man-made alternatives because of the environmental damage that all of that does. So I would just encourage you to think a little bit about where you're getting your fibre from. If the fibre suppliers are not being particularly transparent with where the fibre comes from, email them and ask them. They should be okay with putting out there where their fibre comes from. And I'm actually going to be doing a little bit of writing to various different fibre suppliers that I use to just go, hey, can you just tell me a little bit more about where this fibre comes from? I suspect it's not that traceable for larger companies, but it would be interesting to see them try and up their game on that one. Ideally, I would be able to get in touch with a small ethical supplier, you know, a farmer who is native to the land that those animals are inhabiting and that knows those animals really well, looks after those animals really well. And so I would know that by purchasing that fibre that I'm first of all paying a price that is going to allow that person and their family to live a decent life, but also knowing that those animals and the environment are looked after. Realistically, that's not always possible, and I would love very dearly to know if you have any ideas about resources where we can find out a little bit more information and maybe get in contact with producers of ethical fibres. What I ended up doing was I went to a local spinning expert called Amanda Hannaford. She's pretty local to me, and we see each other at guild meetings and so on. And so I had a discussion with her about specifically cashmere production, because she was involved at one stage with teaching women in Afghanistan how to spin cashmere fibre, basically as part of a project where they would produce cashmere in Afghanistan, basically because it was a choice between using the land for grazing goats or for, you know, producing drug crops. So the idea was, hey, let's give them a good income through something that is a little bit more ethical than the drug trade. For the moment, that project has been kind of put on hold because of the situation in Afghanistan right now. But my hope is that at some stage is able to be sort of seen through to fruition, and we might be able to source fibres from there. That would be fantastic. But Amanda also put me on to a couple of different resources, ways of getting luxury fibres in the UK. And, you know, there are a couple of places that she recommended where she said, you know, honestly, these animals are basically kept as pets. So, you know, they've not been mistreated, which is great. So it's definitely worth asking around to see whether there are any local fibre producers that maybe you just don't know about that have luxury fibres available. So there you go, that was week 36 of the 51 Yarns Spinalong, and this was luxury week. I have my 3 little samples from total nightmare to absolute delight, and I hope you found this episode useful. If you have any questions or comments for me, please drop them in the comments below. YouTube is by far the easiest place for me to catch up on all of those comments. I hope this was useful, and I will see you again very soon with another 51 Yarns episode. Thank you so much for watching. In between now and the next episode, you can find me on Instagram as Tiny Fibre Studio, and on Ravelry I'm Ibex. I will see you again very soon.